Hey guys, it's Josh from Soul Studios again. I wanted to do a follow-up to the RS124 hardware shootout. It got a bigger reaction than I expected, and there were some good questions that were asked in the YouTube comments and on some of the forums. So I just wanted to follow up. In particular, I want to show you exactly how the input works on the P-Lane as well as the DC threshold. And I'm going to narrow it down this time to just the P-Lane and the Chandler RS124. I'm a little cramped here, as you can see. I just set this up quickly to try to add something else that I think will give an even bigger picture of what the P-Lane's capable of, as well as how it stacks up against the Chandler in particular. And if you come across this video first and you're interested in hearing the Highland Dynamics BG2 or the Retro Power Strip, you can go watch the part one of this and you'll see those compressors in action. All right, let's go back to the drum bus example. I'm going to start just with the P-Lane. And we're going to start like I did with DC threshold 1. And a lot of people asked what I think is a fair question. When you read the manual, the DC threshold gives you the impression that as you turn it up higher, so from 1 to 6, as you go towards 6, it should get closer to limiting and be a more aggressive sound. So let me show you what the input does, because there's a little confusion there as whether or not it's an attenuator. I think what you'll see in the end, it doesn't really matter what it is. It just matters about how much gain you can get into the unit. But the main the main thing is that if I had it at 10 the whole time and it was an attenuator, I think there were some people that wanted to make sure I didn't have basically the input turned all the way down. So let's start with the P-Lane, and I'm going to show you how the input works, and we'll cycle through the DC threshold and then talk a little bit after. So as you can see, when you cycle to the higher DC threshold settings, the gain reduction decreases. When it's on 6, the kick was about 2 dB, the snare 3 dB, and when it's on 1, you're hitting between 5 and 7. So the reason that I used it mostly in the shootout on DC threshold 1 setting is because it's a more noticeable sound. And based off the manual, it was my understanding that DC threshold 1 would be like an RS124, and then anything above that was sort of something added. Like Superfuse on the Chandler is not on the original. I thought that the DC threshold would be sort of trying to go beyond, which is cool in theory, but again, it's just so hard to get the amount of gain into this unit to make it like now, okay, we're all the way up at 10. You saw what the input does. We are at the limit of coming out of Pro Tools through the converter to where that signal that's coming out cannot be boosted anymore without clipping the converter. So like I showed in the first video, you can put something else out. Once you're back in the analog domain, you're out of your DAW, out of your converter, out of your D to A, you can use something else to push into the P-Lane harder and then dial the P-Lane output back so that when you're coming back into your converter, you don't clip there either. I don't think most people are going to have anything outside of owning a console that's going to make it easy to say, well, just give it more gain. Well, you can't. That's the point I was trying to get across in the first one. There's not an easy way to do that. And then even when I'm putting the Bluey in front, it's adding something to the sound even when it's on, the dry, all the way on 100% dry. Yes, DC threshold 1 is going to be a lower compression ratio, but an RS124 is not a high ratio compressor. That's not the point. I don't want it to be 20 to 1. It's never been a distressor or an 1176 or something like that. But you should hear something. That's the thing. That's the magic of it. The reason I love an RS124 so much, if I'm hitting 2 dB of compression or I'm hitting 15 to 20, it's doing something, and I can adjust within a wide range of what I want it to do. And Superfuse does add something beyond the original, but it's not even about that. We're going to turn Superfuse off for this drum example, and I'll show you what I mean. Now, one thing I do want to point out, on the Chandler, you start at 0 dB and you go all the way up to 30. So from here to here is 5 dB. On the P.Lane, from here all the way over here is 5 dB. And then you have 7, 10, and then this last little section here is from 10 to 20. From 10 to 20, you've got this much visually that you're working with. So keep in mind, when I'm doing the comparisons here again, if you see the P.Lane hanging all the way over here where it looks like it's doing almost max compression, that's only going to be somewhere about right here on the Chandler, according to the meters, okay? One more thing to note, the Chandler, as I mentioned in the RS124 separate review of just this unit, which you can find on the channel if you're interested, it's perfectly normal for this meter to rest a little bit above 0. So keep in mind, if the P.Lane says it's hitting 5, I'm going to try to hit somewhere around 6 or 7 on the RS124 to make them the same. I'm going to start with something more subtle. We're going to go back down to DC threshold 1 and Superfuse off on the Chandler. Okay, so right in this range, with the P.Lane maxed on its input, fastest attack, fastest release, RS124 Superfuse off, fastest attack, fastest release, both doing about 5 to 7 dB of gain reduction. I think they're similar, but let me show you the problem. With the RS124, let me show you the range that I have even with Superfuse off. So this is demonstrating my frustration. With the RS124, this is way more than I want, but I have so much room to dial back, which to me, if the input is an attenuator, when it's turned all the way up, it should be way too much in most cases, and then you attenuate and dial back to the level of gain reduction that you want. So I can sweep, so in other words, max input on the P.Lane, I'm getting 5 to 7 dB of gain reduction. On the RS124, it's more like 15 to 17. So we're 10 dB off, which makes sense. That there's going to be, in other words, there's a very narrow window that you can make these probably sound somewhat similar. But the problem is, outside of that window, I like to do things very subtly with an RS124, and then on drums like this, I like to push really hard. Those are the areas that I'm not getting out of the P.Lane. That is, And again, I'm not trying to knock the piece of gear. I'm genuinely frustrated because I wanted to buy 2, 3, 4 of these things. And if you've watched my Chandler review, this is my absolute favorite sound of compression. So if anybody does make something that I think is claiming to be this, I'm probably going to do this time and time again. Now, if you go back, just another thing, this is not an issue of price or whether it's made in America or made in China or anything like that. Because if you go back, I also shot out the Chandler RS124 against the RS660 when the 660 first came out. And I think the 660 may even be more expensive than the 124 is. So it's not about price. And even in that video, what I found is where there is some overlap in the RS124 territory in the slower settings of the 660, I didn't personally feel that I could sell the 124 and still have that area totally covered with the 660. In other words, they would complement one another. Well, that's what I hoped that this would be. I didn't want this to be a Chandler replacement. I wanted it to be a complement, maybe even something different and more aggressive with the DC threshold setting, with the super fast release, but it's just not there. Okay, let's hop back over to vocal. I want to do a couple things that I did not do in the other video. I want you to hear the dry vocal and then push the DC threshold all the way up and hear that.
When I see a problem, I run. The walls that you build, and they must weigh a ton. And I'm sorry I haven't been much fun. But I can't control these fears.
Let's start with P-Lane, DC threshold 1, and we'll cycle all the way up to 6.
When I see a problem, I run. The walls that you build, and they must weigh a ton. And I'm sorry I haven't been much fun. But I can't control these fears. When I see a problem, I run. The walls that you build, and they must weigh a ton. And I'm sorry I haven't been much fun. But I can't control these fears. When I see a problem, I run. When I see a problem, I run.
Okay, let's look at the RS124 and see what we can get. Again, super fuse off. Let's see what kind of range we have there.
When I see a problem, I run. The walls that you build, and they must weigh a ton. And I'm sorry I haven't been much fun. But I can't control. When I see a problem, I run. The walls that you build, and they must weigh a ton. And I'm sorry I haven't been much fun. But I can't control these fears.
Okay, so again, the RS124 all the way up is more than I would want, but I can dial it back to a very wide range of very usable stuff. The P-Lane, when it's on DC threshold 6, input all the way up, the last two lines of the verse where he says these fears, it didn't even move. I hate to belabor the point, but the follow-up questions that came up, I just wanted to make sure everyone knew it's not because I wasn't using the highest DC threshold setting, or the input was, I was using the input backwards from how it's supposed to work or something. And like I said in the other video, I have spent infinitely more hours off camera experimenting with these than I did before I ever started filming. So the reason I'm so invested in this is because this is my favorite sound of compression. I really, really hoped that something new was out that was going to allow me to have many more channels of my favorite sound just within the family, because I don't even think the RS124 and the Power Strip and the Revolver and the BG2, they do not sound exactly alike, but there's a familiarity there that it's all within that same range. And it's just somebody's a little bit different take on it, but they're all part of that sound that I love. So anyway, I hope this supplemental video gives you a little more context and answers some of the questions that came up from the first one. I'd love to hear your thoughts now that there's a little more context. So that's all I want to do, is just maybe point you in a direction that helps you cut down on time and cost, because this is hard to do, to get all these compressors in and to take the time to level match them and experiment and figure out what they're doing. I understand why a lot of people don't do this, because honestly, it's a giant pain in the butt. But I want to know because I love this compression so much.